Welcome everyone to the second of our 2015 Discovering Florida lecture series. It's a real pleasure to have you all here and to see so many new faces. Tonight's speaker, Mr. Robert Meeks, is a native Brevard County resident. Woohoo! There's a couple of us still around. Graduated from O'Galley High School, enlisted in the military in 1984, and served nearly 23 years in our military with the U.S. Army and the Florida Army National Guard. Mr. Meeks served our country during 3 wars as a decorated veteran, receiving the Meritorious Service Medal, the Florida Governor's Service Medal, as well as many other medals and awards. Currently, Mr. Meeks works as an industrial security specialist at Harris Corporation here in Melbourne. But tonight's presentation does not focus on his career, more on his obsession, I guess is the safe word, Brevard County Cemetery and Grave Research Project. In this project, and the goal is to present a concise and accurate documentation of all cemeteries and burial grounds that are within the current boundaries of Brevard County, which sounds like an easy task, but as Mr. Meeks, I'm sure, will explain to us, after 37 months and going, it isn't that simple. We've lost a lot of these sites. It's been essentially just lost to history. And the work he's doing is really incredible, and I wish there were more people with that same obsession. The second goal, however, not only documenting, but also to locate, vet, and document all pre-World War I veteran grave sites that are currently within Brevard County. So he's adding another level of complexity to this research. But in the end, this is going to be an incredible and very valuable resource for future generations researching the history of our county and those who lived here in the county. So without further ado, please help me to welcome Mr. Robert Meeks.
Thank you very much. First, I would like to thank the Florida Historical Society for inviting me here this evening, and I especially want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy lives to come hear about what started as a hobby and has become an obsession. But it's fascinating, and I must admit that it's very addicting. I see we even have a gentleman who's driven all the way from Christmas, Florida, to be here. I see we have representatives from the Sons of Confederate Veterans, because I found a lot of good stuff that I know they'll enjoy. So, without further ado, the way this obsession of mine got started, almost simultaneously, I had Mr. Don Young of the SCV ask me if I could possibly research the locations of veteran grave sites in the county that fought in the war between the states, both Union and Confederate. Almost simultaneously, there was an out-of-state genealogist contacted me, asking me to photograph the gravestone of one of her forefathers, gave me the name of the cemetery, and I'm thinking, I'm a veteran, or I'm a hometown boy, that shouldn't be a problem. Had never heard of the cemetery. I'm calling around, nobody's heard of it. Come to find out, after about 2 months of research, the cemetery had changed names 3 times. Come to find out that Brevard was one of many counties within the state that has no vetted and confirmed list of the cemeteries that are within our boundaries. There's only 5 counties within Florida that currently have a vetted list. So I told Don Young, I can do that, no problem. 37 months, I'm still finding cemeteries that no one had record of, except for, back in the 1800s, there were some pioneer burials right over here. Now, in my research, I have purposely excluded Native American burial sites. One, because you have some middens which may contain a body, and you have actual burial sites like, say, Wendover. And I didn't want to assume that this midden may or may not, contain a body. I've never been told I'm OCD, but after all this, I'm thinking I might be. I don't want to assume that there's a body there, document it, and it actually be declared as only a midden. I'd be so embarrassed. So my goals were to identify these cemeteries, research them, locate all of them, document them, and using that list, I will identify the cemeteries that have the greatest probability of containing pre-World War I grave sites. World War I and forward, the government has done a reasonable job of locating and identifying where their veterans are buried at. Pre-World War I, not so much. It's actually a shame. And myself being a veteran, this bothers me tremendously that we don't even know where all of our veterans from that era are located. To form a baseline with the cemeteries, I used 3 sources. There were 3 attempts made to document these cemeteries. One was tried in 1967 by Margaret Mitchell Abney from the Daughters of the American Revolution. I believe the name is pronounced Langelis, Verna G. Langelis, did an attempt in 84, and in 1940, the Work Progress Agency did a veterans grave registration as well. Using that baseline, I went ahead and folded them all together. I weeded out the errors, the duplicates, things of that nature. And then I would speak with some of the people who'd been living here, in the county for much longer than I have, to find out what they knew. Studying old maps, old obituaries. I even had Carolyn Durack, who is an author. She contacted me from Tennessee. And she said, oh, by the way, I wrote 2 books on early Malabar settlements. Do you know of the 3 abandoned cemeteries in Malabar? I called down to Malabar City Hall. They had no idea that there were 3 cemeteries there. So I got documentation on those, so I was able to add those to my list. The Brevard County Property Appraiser's Office website has been a useful tool for me, as well as Ann Rembert from the county. She's been very enthusiastic in assisting me. Dr. Sonny Witt, who is the Deputy Director of Canaveral Air Force Station, is also the author of Drawn to the Light. Extremely helpful with the cemeteries over there on the annexed portions of the island. He actually got in his ATV with a GPS and went out to every single pioneer cemetery out there to get me GPS coordinates. It's off limits, so of course I can't go out there, but he was willing to do the legwork for me. Great guy. A lot of the grids I'm using for the 1940 WPA come from the Public Land Survey System. This breaks everything down into mile square grids and will help me zero in to some of these old cemeteries. My baseline started with 64 cemeteries. Again, I was vetting them out to correct any duplicates or things of that nature. My combined list now stands at 102 cemeteries identified in Brevard County, and I do have GPS coordinates to all of them. I have purposely avoided, like the 1940 WPA, they used road directions. And of course, as we know, a lot of the streets that were in 1940, their directions say turn left on this shell road and go 2/10 of a mile, turn right on the dirt road. Doesn't help me out nowadays. So I've gone with GPS because that's not going to change. Then my cemetery list gets further broken down, color-coded, as you can see, and I'll show you an example up on the screen here momentarily. A cemetery that is modern, I'm leaving that as a white listing. The yellows are the cemeteries that contain some modern and some of the older, potentially pre-World War I graves maybe. They're green highlighted are the cemeteries that I have confirmed pre-World War I grave sites there. The yellow highlighted cemeteries are going to require what I call a cemetery crawl. And that's going to be where I have to go through and personally transcribe the documentation, then go back and pull military records to see if that individual is or is not a pre-World War I veteran. This gives you an idea of what I was working with previously from the listings that were made in 1967 and 1984. And this is an exact transcription. So you've got the spelling errors there. As you can see, Wolf Creek, Fort Drum, Bull Creek, no longer within the confines of current-day Brevard County. As you know, through history, Brevard County has fluctuated in size, so my research is limited to current-day borders of Brevard County. This is what the list looks like now. As you can see, got my GPS coordinates here. I am using the WGS 84 tracking, which allows anyone to enter those GPS coordinates and they can pull up the satellite imagery and get an aerial view of that spot. I've also listed by the closest proximity of the town nearby, as well as the name, also known as. For example, we have Bethel Greater Mount Olive AMT Church Community Cemetery, also known as White Lily Cemetery, also known as the Courtney Cemetery Colored, established 1892. So the various name changes, in case a researcher going back through records says my forefather was buried at the Veteran Cemetery in Brevard County, it's all going to tie together. At least that's my goal. Now the cemetery issues, and there's quite a few of them in Brevard County, like for example the 3 abandoned cemeteries in Malabar. Only one of them are identified in the tax appraiser's website as being a cemetery and therefore protected. The other 2 are not documented as cemeteries. They're listed as non-developed residential or non-developed commercial property. So someone can buy that, build another strip mall on top of them, and that cemetery and the bodies therein are lost. And that's a shame. That should not be allowed to happen. Up in Rockledge, thanks to Dad, who talked to Mr. Baxley, we were able to get all of the deed listings as well as the plat map for that entire cemetery. How a city can lose 11.64 acres, 4,064 grave plats of a cemetery is beyond me, but that cemetery was lost. It has not been maintained since about 1927, so it's very rough terrain, extremely overgrown, and they have no idea how many bodies are still there. There were some disinterments with bodies being reinterred elsewhere, but it's been confirmed. Matter of fact, Larry, you went out there. Larry told me he stumbled in the brush twice, and when he fell, he did not even hit the ground because there was so much undergrowth. But we have confirmation that there are still graves out there.
Rockledge wants to sell that as commercial property.
Yes, sir. That property is currently listed as non-developed commercial property. It's not protected. And again, once the stuff we can confirm all of this, we can turn this over to the county and have that usage code, or request to have that usage code changed to protect that land. The first black cemetery in Melbourne has been located. There is no current visible signs above ground that it's there, and it is listed as non-developed residential. Again, I would like to get that changed and that area protected. All of the areas in Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral Air Force Station are off limits. There were at one time, to my knowledge, 17 settlements out there, and there are a number of cemeteries out there. The government has been working very hard to protect them, but I do want to make sure that they are documented. Kevin Godetsko, I heard him speak one time, and he made a point that I found to be very accurate and spot on. He said that in a cemetery, there are 2 types of people. There are the dead, and these are the people who their grave sites are maintained. Loved ones still come out, bring them flowers or mementos. They are mourned. And there are those that are truly dead. And these are the people who have passed on. No one cares for their grave sites. No one brings them mementos or flowers. They are truly dead. They have been forgotten. And that's where we start losing our cemeteries, is when these people who have been forgotten, the entire cemetery ends up that way. It's either nobody cares or people forget about it and the cemetery is lost to us. Speaking of lost cemeteries, this is one of the abandoned cemeteries in Malabar. I went out there, beating around the bushes, and eventually found a headstone, or the remains of one. And I do know that there's more than one body out there. I do have that documentation, but that's the only thing I could find out there. So when time permitted, I went back out there just a couple months ago, probing around, clearing brush, doing some digging. I wanted to try to find some more gravestones. What I found instead, after some digging, was the broken remains of the headstone. Utilizing that information, A.M. Smith died September 11th, 1928. I was able to access enough information to identify him as Augustus McNeill Smith. He was born about 1848 in Scotland. His wife died before he did, so his wife supposedly is buried somewhere out there in the woods as well. But it's very heartbreaking for me to have to rebury the remains of that headstone to protect it from vandals, because this cemetery is no way identified or marked or fenced in, and I feared for the safety of what was left of that headstone. But that's shameful. This was someone's loved one. And I know that I would never want my grave to turn out like that. And I'm sure he didn't want that either. And that is one of the premises of my research, is I want to try to protect these people and these cemeteries. Okay, this cemetery here has caused me all kinds of heartburn for years. The Stuart Family Private Cemetery. Again, using the coordinates here from the 1940 WPA, it narrows it down to this section right here. This one, not even a full mile grid because of the water. In this cemetery are confirmed to be Sergeant Israel Montgomery Stuart, who was the father of the family. His wife is buried there as well, and one of their sons, Second Lieutenant David Montgomery Stuart of the Confederate States. Israel Stuart fought in the Second Seminole Indian War. The WPA, here we go with those lovely directions. From 1940, you find the north boundary of O'Galley, and you drive north on US 1 for 5.5 miles. The cemetery lies on the west side of the highway. Well, I can tell you right now, I drove past there, Dad and I drove past there on the way up here. There is no cemetery there. There's no signs of, well, any old homestead. This is what it used to look like in 1940. The grid runs right up through here. There was a homestead down here, and there was one right up here. So we only had 2 homesteads within that mile grid there. You can see the white line is the old US 1, and the yellow line is current locations. So, oh, and by the way, the Stuart family, this is the Stuart family that founded the small settlement of Bonaventure, which was just up the road there. At its peak, it had about 500 people. That settlement has pretty much dissolved and been absorbed into what we have out here now. But, of course, this is the best imagery I can find from 1940, and I do not know if the cemetery, which homestead that cemetery was in their front yard. But in 1880, there was this map to further confirm. Here we have number 13 and 14. They were both Stuart family members. So I know that both of those homesteads could have contained that cemetery. My fear is that that cemetery was paved over during the expansion of US 1, and there are no records of bodies being disinterred and reinterred. So it's looking like, unfortunately, that we've got 2 veteran graves that got plowed right over and put asphalt on top of them. Somebody thought enough of the Stuart family to place a memorial stone for Israel Stuart and his wife at the Oaklawn Cemetery in Titusville, but did put the notation that they're not even buried there. This was merely a memorial stone. I've contacted Oaklawn, and they have no idea when that stone was put in there or who put it in there. So it doesn't really assist me, but at least I'm not the only one who realizes that the Stuart Private Cemetery is elsewhere. Ardenhurst number 1, that's what the government called that one in 1940. Again, it's got our directions, so if anyone knows where Miss Margaret Drennan lives, of course there's no houses out there now, but according to 1940 WPA, there was a cemetery about 600 feet south of her residence. I'm assuming that amongst those groves there, her residence was somewhere in this area. And the 600 feet south, I don't know if they mean south by road distance or by map distance. But somewhere, it was identified by the government that there was a cemetery out there. There are no above ground indications of a cemetery. Very frustrating. Ardenhurst number 2, as the government identifies it. Again, this time we're looking for Mr. Herbert Navman. The cemetery is 75 feet north of his residence. This is the old Haulover Canal right here. I'm sure locals around here recognize that. Again, I don't know if that's his residence right here. This is the old Sykes Grove, orange groves there. And one thing that I just found out recently, that area right there was an area called Fort Anne. That was a fort. You recognize that? That was a Second Seminole Indian War fort. And I spoke to Dr. Sonny Witt. He and I were discussing Fort Anne. And I made the assumption, of course, very primitive area, a lot of mosquitoes, diseases, you get soldiers out there. I said there's a very high probability that some of these soldiers died and were buried in the proximity of their fort. So whether or not this cemetery, which the government called Ardenhurst number 2, is a combination of Second Seminole Indian War soldiers buried there as well as locals from that time frame, I don't know yet. But the way I was able to confirm the location of Fort Anne using this topography here is I found a map from 1881, hand-drawn, and utilizing the terrain features of Old Haulover Canal, as well as the terrain features of the shoreline here, and your little bay. It perfectly meshes up with the Old Haulover Canal, that little outjutting, and the bay right there. Fort Anne was right there, right by the Sykes orange groves. All ties together. Again, unfortunately, on this one, it doesn't show a location or doesn't list a cemetery there. But it's all tying together, and it makes me very suspicious that, again, we have more veteran graves in that location. Gillespie. Oh, yes, this is a really sad one here. Again, we have our directions here from the WPA, which would place our cemetery right in this location right here, according to my measurements on the map. Joseph Gillespie was a personal physician for the King of Spain back in the early 1800s. He was granted a land grant, 9 April 1817, of 43,000 acres. The government did identify a cemetery there back in 1940. Depending on how old this cemetery is, by matching it with that date, this could potentially be the oldest cemetery in Brevard County. What we have nowadays would place it right about there on the southern end of the runway of Tycho Airport. I did speak with some gentlemen. It would be, I guess, second or third hand information that when these orange groves were placed in or were being placed in, apparently the foreman was told, there's a cemetery over here. And of course, you legally cannot build on top of a graveyard. Foreman said, I don't care, get my orange trees in there. So it's looking like, unfortunately, we have orange trees growing on Brevard County's oldest cemetery. This is a map from 1827. You can see your Gillespie grant right there. Something near and dear to my heart. I guess we can claim this as a victory. Up in Sharps, there's a very small cemetery, about a 1/4 acre. Very, very small cemetery. And it was very quickly becoming overgrown. We were in jeopardy of losing this one to Mother Nature. It wasn't being cared for, filled with trash. It was in very bad shape. In the center of this cemetery, there was a wrought iron fence, and you can see it was in very bad shape there. This is a child's grave. Her name was Bertha Faber. She died 1890. She was aged 1 year, 13 days. somebody, and I don't know who yet, whether it's a descendant of the family or just a local who's touched by this child being out here all by herself, somebody still comes and leaves mementos, whether it be flowers, a stuffed bear, ornaments, and even part of a candy cane. I thought that was very nice. Well, Don Young of the Sons of Confederate Veterans said, Sons of Confederate Veterans, we'll take that cemetery and we'll get it cleaned right up. So that's been quite a bit of work, and the county has been working closely with the Sons of Confederate Veterans to haul off these large amounts of limbs and debris that's been cleaned up out of there. And I think it's wonderful. To top that, Don Young and my dad said, and Larry, said, well, for this child and the community, we are going to repair and refurbish and get that fence line taken care of for that child. There's no other Faber family members marked in that cemetery, so we'll take care of that child. We'll take care of that baby. Now, my daughter's 8 years old, and she has been out there, so she's asked me, who's that little girl, and, what can you tell me about her? So, of course, let me take this little side branch here and start doing my research. Very fortunately, on the tombstone, it has the mother and father's name. So using that as my seeds, I began doing my research. I find out that her father, Albert Faber, was an early settler in the Sharps area. He planted an orange grove there. The mother's name was Barbara, maiden name Joyner. And for anyone who's familiar with that family, they married into the Quarterman family. The Quartermans were very early settlers over in the Canaveral area. Matter of fact, her great-grandfather was William George Middleton Quarterman, who at one time was a school teacher out on Canaveral, and it was his son who was the fourth, if I'm not mistaken, the fourth lighthouse keeper. And one thing that I thought was really, really special is that Albert Faber, this little girl's father, was a Union soldier. He was a soldier a private with the 47th Ohio Infantry. He was wounded in action in Shiloh. He carried a bullet around in him until the day he died in 1927, and apparently this bullet caused him a lot of pain and a lot of discomfort. But like I say, I think it's really wonderful that the Sons of Confederate Veterans have stepped up and are taking care of this, not only the cemetery, but paying special attention to this child of a Union soldier and taking care of her her burial. And that's what we're looking at right now. You saw how the fence line, this is the gate right here, how it used to look. And after my father working his magic, that's what we're looking at now for the gate, where the entire fence line is going to be restored and replaced. The Sons of Confederate Veterans, Don Young, has told me that the Sons of Confederate Veterans, when they do restoration projects like this, like to keep as much of the original material and design as possible so it stays authentic, because that's what the family had there. It obviously meant a lot to them, that design, and so the Sons of Confederate Veterans want to keep it as authentic as possible. So hat tip to those gentlemen. The veterans. Oh, and by the way, as far as her family, I did find that her mother and father and 2 of her 4 brothers are buried in West Palm Beach, even though her mother lived to be 106 years of age. Why they were sent down and buried in West Palm Beach, I do not know, but as far as I can find, little Bertha is all by herself. For the veterans, of course, myself being a veteran, this is near and dear to my heart. Veterans should not be forgotten. And I've had people who have a little heartburn that I might be doing some research on individuals who fought in the Seminole Wars or Confederate soldiers. And I'm not here to debate ideology with anyone. These were all Americans. They all fought, and they're all recognized by the U.S. government as being American veterans, and so I will locate and I will vet every single one of them. When I do go through, well, I use the baseline for the 1940, 1941 WPA, as well as what was the Florida Fact Finders website. Mitch Morgan had given them information which very closely meshed with that 1940 WPA cemetery survey that identified the veterans. I am not going to be one who just looks and says, yep, that matches. I don't function that way. What I do is I get that information and I actually vet their service. I go through, I pull their military records, and then on top of that, I'll also do a basic genealogy research to confirm that that individual buried there is indeed that soldier that the government claims honorably and served and is indeed buried there. So I want to make sure that my information is correct. What we started with was one veteran from the War of 1812. People are rather surprised to find that there is one of those buried here in Brevard County. We had 4 Seminole Indian Wars, 72 Confederate, 26 Union, and 10 Spanish-American War veterans. Again, I'm hoping that once I can get this list turned over to the state and the county and the Florida Historical Society, that these veterans can have their graves marked on Memorial Day and Veterans Day, and should not be forgotten their military service. Now with my baseline, of course, I do find a lot of problems that some of the earlier wars, these soldiers were illiterate. So they would tell the sergeant or the officer their name, and that individual is going to write it down as it sounds to them, and that soldier cannot confirm that that's actually how the name should be spelled. So there are some problems that I'm coming across as far as differences in name. Again, going to prove or disprove military service, and I'll touch on that here momentarily. A lot of errors in the WPA records. The obituaries, gravestones, newspaper articles, family lore, I do not use as trusted sources. Things get embellished, there's errors, but I can use that as a reference to try to give me some good ideas and good keys to go off of. My muster rolls and pension requests are what I'm using as my trusted sources, that they did indeed serve. But of course, I'm keeping in mind that, again, there may be some spelling differences or errors in those documents as well. This is what I started with. Got some names here, but as you can see, there's data missing in quite a bit of it. Cemeteries and the closest cities. So that's what I started with. And that's the same sheet, but with data what we're looking at now. What I have here in the white, this is still information I have not confirmed one way or the other. The green is the information that I had previously. I have confirmed it, and everything's legitimate on that. The orange or the gold coloration is information that I have added and confirmed. So the information is fleshing out very nicely. So any of these descendants or historical researchers have a lot more information to work with now. Now, the wars, and there were quite a few of them, what I have done is I've pulled it back all the way to the War of 1812, which I've confirmed as our oldest veteran buried here in the county served in. The Indian Wars out west, which there were so many of them, I've compiled into one grouping. The Seminole Wars being due to our locale, I have specifically broken that down by 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Seminole Indian Wars, and I have segregated those gentlemen separate from the American Indian Wars. Your Mexican-American War, your war between the states, your Spanish-American War, your Philippine-American War. That becomes tricky because you have to, when you do get military records, you have to confirm your discharge dates, which one is falling into, so you can confirm which war they fought in, because they were very close proximity to each other. Not everything is as cut and dried as Corporal Roberts in the Melbourne Cemetery. He is thus far my only confirmed Philippine-American War veteran here in the county. And that was just so easy. It was beautiful. I wish all of them could be like that. Unfortunately, they're not. Major Maurice Goldsmith Sr. It looks so easy. I was able to identify or get his obituary from 1904, and I've highlighted some areas here that I used as keys. It talks about where Mr. Goldsmith was at during the war. He was in Columbia, South Carolina, and what he did. He was in manufacturing. Talks about when Mr. Goldsmith came down to Florida in 1889, that he was admitted to the bar. States here, Mr. Goldsmith was an officer in the Confederate Army, and at the time of his death was a major on the staff of General Law of the Florida Division of the United Confederate Veterans. Down here states that Mr. Goldsmith, highly cultured gentleman, well-read and speaking 7 languages. Very useful information. But when I start researching Mr. Goldsmith, I find out that, according to the National Park Service, searching through South Carolina units, there was no Maurice Goldsmith that served or is listed as serving in the Confederacy. There were 4 M. Goldsmiths that served in the South Carolina units. That's from the same database, but none were officers. So we're already coming into conflict with this obituary information. Now, Mr. Goldsmith was well educated. He operated businesses, admitted to the bar, and reportedly spoke 7 languages. I highly doubt he was a private. That would have been a waste of a lot of intellect there. Not saying he wasn't, but I would highly doubt it. Now, it states that he was a major on the staff of General Law of the Florida Division of the United Confederate Veterans. It does not say that he was a major in the Confederate States Army. So my assumption is whoever placed that modern gravestone there may have used that and made a slight error. So I do find 1 M. Goldsmith in South Carolina that was not a private. He was a first sergeant, Company C, South Carolina Artillery Militia. I don't know if that's our Mr. Goldsmith or not, so the jury's still out on that. But clearly, to my records, my research, he was not a major in the Confederate States Army. Was a Confederate, but not a major.
That person may have been from Kentucky. Everybody that retired from the Army in Kentucky was colonels. You knew that.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Well, this gentleman here is a good example. I'm sure a lot of people here local have heard of Major Magruder. Well, Major Cephas Bailey Magruder, he was a well-known individual here in the early times of Rockledge. He is one of, I believe, 2 people who is credited with giving the name to Rockledge. He built a house after the war. He built a house down on the river up on the Coquina Shoals, and he was very proud of this. He would write letters to friends and family in other areas and would talk about his beautiful house on the Rock Ledge. If you look at early maps, as a matter of fact, Rockledge is spelled Rock Ledge. Not 1 word, but 2. So, possibly Mr. Magruder was indeed the guy who gave Rockledge its name. Now, he did enlist in the Confederate Army at Camp Leon, Florida, as a private in Company K, 5th Florida Infantry. That's our gentleman there. He was discharged the same day after providing a substitute, which was done in both the Union and Confederate armies if you had the money. You pay someone to pull your military duty. There is no evidence that Mr. Magruder ever saw combat, but nonetheless, he was known as Major Magruder for the rest of his life. Unfortunately, and I imagine it was a horrible guilt thing for him, but his substitute was killed in combat in August of 1862 at the Battle of Second Manassas. Major Magruder is currently buried in one of those 2 unmarked plots right here. No gravestone, so unfortunately he gets no recognition on Veterans Day or Memorial Day, at least not a headstone that somebody can plant a flag on. This is at Cocoa City Cemetery. So poor Major Magruder, who's historic for the area, unmarked grave. Mr. Frank B. Sackett. He's listed in 1940 WPA as a Union veteran, buried up in LaGrange Cemetery. He was a crewman on the USS Vindicator and the USS Blackhawk. However, his wife's pension request for her deceased husband was denied. There we go, disapproved. There is no indication on his headstone of military service, which I found rather puzzling, but not unique. So I started researching this gentleman. When he died in the late 1800s, his wife lived on for quite some time. Apparently, she had an accident later in life that completely blinded her. She was living with family members, and so therefore submitted a pension request to try to help out, because she was, I'm sure, a financial drain on the family. She tried for, good Lord, years and years and years. I mean, there's stacks of paperwork of her requests, and it's all being denied. Come to find out that her husband, Mr. Sackett, was never in the military. Yes, he was a crewman on the Vindicator and the Blackhawk, but he was a civilian crewman. So, unfortunately, Mrs. Sackett, after being denied many times, finally gave up and the request was abandoned. Whether or not she ever got any compensation, I see nothing in the archives about, but I find it rather sad that even though he served just as the military guys did, he got no pension, or I should say his wife got no pension. Very, very sad. The Simmons brothers. I imagine this family had a lot of fun on Thanksgiving. We have Andrew Jackson Simmons, who joined the 2nd Florida Cavalry, United States, which was a Union unit formed out of Florida. He's buried in the O'Galley Cemetery. His brothers, however, all joined the Confederacy. This brother, Philip Minton, also buried in the O'Galley Cemetery, was with the 8th Florida Infantry. And these 3 gentlemen are buried out west of our borders. But like I say, 4 brothers Confederate, 1 Union. I bet that was very entertaining conversations over Thanksgiving dinner after the war. No pressure, no stress.
Did they outlive they did die in the war?
Correct, they all survived.
Oh, yes.
Now, going through St. Luke Cemetery in Merritt Island, there is this very small, chipped marble headstone. It's flat in the ground, about that size. This is one of the ones we're going through. I was able to document the name. And with that lifespan there tells me, okay, well, he was alive during various wars. Let me do my research. Well, I find him, an old obituary of his, Major William J. Teed. It gives me enough information that I know that he was out of the Illinois area. So doing some research, I find him. Major William J. Teed, U.S. Army. He was not known to the state and the county as being a Union veteran. Even the 1940 WPA didn't document him. He slipped right through the cracks. Major Teed was twice breveted. In other words, whereas he was a major, he did gallant duty, and they said, okay, you did so good, we're going to give you the responsibility of a lieutenant colonel. And he did this twice, so eventually he had the responsibility, but not the pay, of a full colonel. So he, did a good job for his country. He was with the 8th Missouri Volunteer Cavalry, and there was a very bad day for him. He and a Captain John Matthews, also the 8th, were ambushed by Confederate guerrillas. Not Confederate troops, but guerrillas. They were dressed in Union blue outside of Duval's Bluff on December 1863. This Captain Matthews was shot 3 times, and Major Teed was shot 5 times. Teed's right arm was broken, a ball pierced his side, and he was struck in the back near his spine. In August of 1864, when he had sufficiently recovered, he was declared unfit for military service due to his injuries and had to resign his commission. He became a provost marshal until the end of the war, and then after the war he became the editor for the Springfield Patriot and later moved to Chicago, and then eventually he retired down to Florida in 1905 and died in Courtenay, Florida in 1950. Again, nobody knew he was a veteran, but we do now. And the Feasters. I don't know if anybody in the area knows of the Feaster family, but they were very early settlers. This is the gravestone for Corporal Andrew Feaster, who was our veteran of the War of 1812. Even have his application for his headstone there. This is interesting because it gets very convoluted amongst his brother and sons, and it's, you know, I guess back in those days they weren't real creative in names, so you have a lot of names that reappear. Anyways, in LaGrange Cemetery, you have Jacob Jefferson Norris Feaster, who was Andrew's son, and you have John Mobley Feaster, buried over in Oaklawn, who I do believe was his brother, Andrew's brother. According to the 1940 WPA, it identifies these two gentlemen as serving in the Confederacy with the 2nd Florida Confederate Cavalry. Unfortunately, the records don't match up with dates, and there seems to be a lot of confusion going on. Neither of these Brevard graves identify or indicate military service. 32 Feasters served in the Confederacy, according to the National Park Service. There were no widow's pensions or soldier's pension to either of those two gentlemen, and there were only two soldiers by the name of Feaster on file serving with the 2nd Florida Cavalry, Confederate States Army. Now, if we get to Mr. Jacob Jefferson Norris Feaster's obituary, it identifies that he was actually with Colonel T.J. Tucker. Now, there is no Colonel T.J. Tucker in the National Park Service database. Now, there was a Julius G. Tucker who served in South Carolina where Jacob was living during the war. So possibly there was a mistake again in the obituary. 1860 census confirms that Jacob was living in Richland, Columbia, South Carolina. It also says in the obituary that he was a member of the Highland Rifle Company. I can't find any documentation on that, whether it might have been a home guard or a militia. No knowledge, but I can't find any documentation on such a unit. So we already have confusion because the WPA is saying that this gentleman served in a Florida unit, but yet he was living in South Carolina, and according to the obituary, he served in South Carolina units. Now, in 1930, somebody sent a request into the government doing the same thing I'm trying to do, is find out information on Jacob's military service. 1870 is Jacob's first census showing where he's living in Brevard or in Florida, period. And I do find numerous Confederate citizen files showing that he was providing goods and services for the Confederate Army. Now, in 1930, when this lady requested information, somebody hand-wrote information on here that he was a quartermaster sergeant, that he enlisted in Columbia, South Carolina in 1864. Can't find any scanned images or any transcribed information to confirm a quartermaster sergeant from Columbia, South Carolina by that name. Like I say, I do find information in the Confederate citizen records showing Jacob Feaster providing goods and services to the Confederates. But this has me puzzled. So again, the jury is still out. He might have been a Confederate with South Carolina, and the WPA has made an error. But over in Micanopy, west central part of the state, we find Jacob M. Feaster, who was actually one of the sons of John M. Feaster, John Mobley, who's buried here in the county. So I'm thinking that somebody made a mistake and confused the two Jacob Feasters, the one in Brevard, and assigned him the service of this gentleman. And here we have the application for the headstone and the actual headstone over in the Feaster Family Cemetery in Micanopy. Right next to him is his brother, also a John Feaster, except his name is Pickett, but we got a picture of him. He was a corporal and got his information as well. So it looks like the John and Jacob here in Brevard have been confused with their kin buried over in Micanopy, but like I say, it's still very confusing and convoluted. Now, as far as John Mobley Feaster, buried up in LaGrange, he was the father of those two gentlemen buried over in Micanopy. 1860 census does show him living in Florida, however. Confederate citizen files show him transporting and providing goods to the Confederate Army. And John would have been about 55 years of age at the start of the war between the states. A little bit long in the tooth to be out there beating the brush with the young guys. So I'm doubtful that he was a Confederate soldier. But I haven't found confirmation that he wasn't. So he is listed on my roster of soldiers in red, that doubtful. Henry Wilson. I don't know if any of you recognize that name. Again, a very early settler. To my research, he looks like he's going to be, or he is so far, the only pre-World War I veteran we have in the county. At the age of 16 or 17 in 1847, he joined the Army and was immediately deployed down to fight in the Mexican-American War with the 2nd Regiment U.S. Artillery. That's even what his headstone states right there. At the close of the Mexican-American War, he was deployed over to Florida. Now, during the Second Seminole War, was the Cape Florida lighthouse south of here was attacked by Seminole Indians, and there were lighthouse keeper and some other folks were killed there. I think it was the assistant lighthouse keeper and another gentleman had to scale the outside railway or the stairs to hide at the very top, and it was a close run thing for them. So the U.S. Army, fearing that the Canaveral Lighthouse may also potentially be threatened, they deployed then Corporal Wilson and 2 or 3 other soldiers to keep an eye on Canaveral Lighthouse. This would have been, again, at the close of the Mexican-American War. So, of course, the lighthouse in Canaveral was never threatened by the Seminoles, so Corporal Wilson pretty much didn't have anything to do except to sit back and admire the cute daughter of the current lighthouse keeper at the time. I think that was the Burnham family. And so in 1855, at the beginning of the 3rd Seminole Indian War, Henry Wilson went ahead and he left military service, and in 1856, he married Mr. Burnham's daughter. So I have not been able to confirm what unit Corporal Wilson served with, but he was there during the time. And then, of course, when the war between the states kicked off, he did enlist in the Confederacy, and he served 4 years, I do believe it was, and was currently serving up in the front lines when he was granted furlough. He was coming down south to return home to Canaveral so he could spend time with his wife. He walked the last 175 miles, which would place him right at about the Georgia-Florida state line, and he walked the rest of the way to get back home. By the time he was home and trying to relax a little bit, the war ended, and so he was discharged out. But got the records on 2 of the 3 units that he was with, but thus far I've confirmed him as being the only pre-World War I veteran we have in the county. He is buried over in the Cape Canaveral Cemetery, over on the annexed portion of the island.
With the information you've just given, he was probably fighting with Robert E. Lee in Mexico.
Correct.
Wow.
Yep.
He knew.
Now, what we started with is, as you saw earlier, we had 1 War of 1812 veteran, no change there. I have located 6 more Seminole War veterans, 1 American Indian War veteran, that's Thomas J. Thompson, who was a 1st sergeant. He's buried over in the annexed portion. His unit was the group that captured Geronimo out west. He's buried over in the annexed portions as well. 1 Mexican-American War veteran, who would be Henry Wilson. I've added 17 Confederates, 23 Union, 6 Spanish-American war veteran, and 1 Philippine-American war veteran. So our numbers continue to increase, which I think is a wonderful thing. I hope to get all these veterans recognized and so that they are not forgotten for the service they have provided to our country.
I want to thank Mr. Meeks for coming out this evening.
Thank you.
And